Today we're going to be learning about ecological succession. There are two types. One is primary and the other is secondary. And we're going to go through each one um, to see how it goes. So ecological succession are changes that occur in the ecosystem as a result of a sudden disturbance. Something happens. It could be a severe storm. It could be a tsunami. It could be a hurricane. It could be a volcano. And then how the ecosystem responds to bring back that ecosystem to where it was before the disturbance. So the proper definition is a series of predictable changes in an ecosystem after a disturbance. So there's always a predictable way ecosystems survive or come back to where they used to be. So that is what our succession is showing us. And there are two types of succession. There's primary, and primary starts with bare rock. They have nothing on them. It's bare rock. And what would cause this maybe is like a volcano. So volcano, right? Lets out all the lava, goes everywhere, spreads all over the place. And then when it dries, it's only rock. There's no soil anywhere. So it's how that ecosystems comes back from something like that. It takes a long, long time. And that's called primary succession. And it starts with rock. Okay. Then we have secondary succession. And an example of secondary succession would be like a fire, forest fire or something. Or a flood would also be one. And this starts with soil. So our soil is still there, right? So this is a good thing, and this will speed up the process a lot. So let's talk about primary succession. So again, primary succession, no rock whatsoever. No soil whatsoever. All we have is rock. So in these pictures are examples of volcanic rock here. And what happens is that a pioneer species comes in and can live on that rock. So what you see on the rock here, this stuff is called lichen. And although you're like, I don't know what lichen is. You see it every day. Trust me, every day you see it. They're on the trees outside at school, and you often see them on trees and stuff. But they're the first ones that can grow on bare rock, and they're called lichen. So the CH is pronounced as a K, lichen. So what happens is the lichen comes, and then some moss can come because they can kind of work on bare rock as well. So after a long, long, long time, the lichen starts breaking down the rock, and eventually it will become soil. So what happens is lichen is living, right? So it has nitrogen in it. So as it's breaking down this soil, it's adding nitrogen and nutrients into the soil to help make that soil fertile. Not fertile, but easier for things to grow in. So you can see eventually pioneer species die, adding that organic material to help form soil for plants to grow. Okay, next here's a cute little cartoon. We have the rocks. This is how it's going to happen. Now, this could take hundreds of years for this to happen. So we have our bare rock. We have our lichen that's breaking down the rock. After we have soil, we'll have weeds and then small bushes and then little trees and then a huge ecosystem back. So we can see this process, but this will take a long time. Okay, so here's another example. Here's my bare rock, right? There's nothing on it, nothing on it. Then comes my pioneer species, my lichen here, and a little moss, and it will start to break hundreds of years. Break this rock down. I mean, could you imagine that little tiny speckles breaking a rock? I couldn't break a rock if I tried. But over time, it will break it down. And with that dead, when it dies, right, the lichen and the moss, it's add nutrients to the soil. So you can see here that rocks are broken down and turns into soil. And since it has the nutrients in them now, it can grow small things, right? So you might get weeds and little grasses and then shrubs and then you'll get soft, smaller trees that come up. And then eventually you're going to get to what's called a climax community. And a climax community is what that ecosystem looked like before the disturbance. So before the volcano. Um, so here we're going over this. The pioneer species is the first species to settle in an area. I don't know if you guys ever studied the pioneers that settled the west of the United States. So the pioneers are always the first out in an area, right? Like when the astronauts first went up to space, they were called the pioneers, right? Because they're doing new ventures and going into new places. So pioneer species are those um, organisms that do that. So in primary succession, it's the lichen. Now, when we get to secondary succession, it's going to be weeds because secondary, which we're going to get to after this, is with fire. And a climax community is when the ecosystem is stable after this whole disturbance has happened. So it's like the grown up ecosystem. So we had we had a volcano, we had a baby, and you know how helpless babies are, and they have to be nurtured and everything, and then eventually they become a grown up, right? So a stable ecosystem. Okay, so here's our secondary succession. And the big thing here is it has soil. And an example of what would cause this is like a forest fire. So if there's like let's say our city caught fire and burned everything down, we would still have the ground, right? We would still have that soil. So we're already ahead of the game from primary succession because we have that soil. We don't really need that lichen and moss to break down all those rocks. So this is a much shorter time of a recovery. So it takes much less time to get to our climax community than it would for primary succession. And here's a little picture of some here. So we see in year 0, there's just soil there. 7 years later, we have weeds and stuff like this. And then we have bushes. And then 30 years, we're looking at the beginnings of a forest, right? And so we can see here it gets more mature. Where in primary succession, where this took 150 years, it would be like, 500 years or something. So here's a picture of secondary succession. So we have and picture number 1, this is, look, my climax community. It looks beautiful, right? It's all going on. And then, oh my God, a fire hits, right? So it's burning up the trees and everything. And then when we look at 3, it's now burned up the grasses and anything that was growing on the ground. And then in number 4, we see we're just left with soil. There's nothing else but soil. So what's nice is that things can grow back much quicker when it's just soil. So in number 5, we see our pioneer species starting to come back. Our weeds and our small grasses and stuff come back. And then after those come back, more smaller bushes and little tiny trees come back. And then in number 7, we can see the trees are getting bigger and growing more. And then in number 8, we are back to where we started, right? So we've reached our climax community here. Okay, so if we look at these two pictures, here's our primary succession and our examples starting with a volcano. And we can see over on this side over here that we're left with bare rock, and lichen is going to grow there. And this takes a very long time. And down below here, we have secondary succession. And our example is a forest fire. And when the forest fire burns everything down, the soil remains. So it's a much quicker recovery for that ecosystem. And that's it. Have a great day.